Precision medicine to me is kind of straightforward. It's about data. Being personal to me is why you become a doctor. Every doctor should be personal about their patient because everyone's unique.
Welcome to Taking Care of Lady Business, where we have conversations about power, value, and success on your own terms. I'm talking with women who are building influence, wealth, and authority, not by following someone else's playbook, but by deciding what success looks like for themselves. These are candid conversations, hard-earned perspectives, and no BS insight from women who aren't asking permission. They're setting the standard. I'm your host, Jennifer Justice. Most people call me JJ. Let's get into it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Taking Care of a Lady Business. I'm Jennifer Justice. Today, we have Dr. Florence Comite. She is the founder of the Comite Center for Precision Medicine and Healthy Longevity. Did I say this right?
Got it perfect.
Oh my God. Amazing. And I'm so happy to be talking to you about this. As we were talking a little bit earlier, like women's health is such a big topic, but it always centers just around perimenopause and menopause. And thank God it's finally being told. But I have a boy and a girl twin. And they have different chromosomes. Their bodies work very differently, right? They're 13 years old. Right now, I can really tell their bodies are working differently. This is a big thing. And all these longevity doctors, et cetera, seem to be these male opinions that might kind of apply, but not wholly apply to us. And I know you treat men and women too, as we were talking about before. Like, it's just so nice to have a woman's voice here and talking about longevity. So thank you. It's a long-winded way of saying thank you and welcome to the show.
Well, women started this, is the reason I'm on this journey, in part because I was doing a lot of work using peptides in women to help them conceive, to do. In fact, the basis of some of my work in peptides is how women go through in vitro fertilization, because I help to bring the agonist, the superagonist peptide called Lupron and Nefarelin to market, and it shuts down the system. I first started in children, actually. So from 10 to 90s and in utero. And so infertility, endometriosis, pain, fibroids, ovarian cysts. And I noticed the changes that women would come back to me and say, I don't feel great. My mom had a heart attack in her 60s. My dad's alive and well in his 90s after an angioplasty. What do I do? And many of these women were having babies a little late because it was in the 90s. So birth control pills became available first in the 60s, right? You could delay pregnancy, or they were looking forward to a second career and they wanted help. And I realized that when I looked at their biomarkers, or labs, as people used to call it, they were on their way to disease. And I wondered how to stop it in its tracks, because perimenopause is a transition. The 30s and 40s is when our bodies begin to change, but not necessarily obviously. We blame it on how busy we are. We have aging parents, we have young kids, we're at a career, we do this, we do that. So we don't really pay attention to the fact that our bodies are really changing under the surface because we're too busy taking care of everyone else.
Define what precision medicine is.
So precision medicine to me is kind of straightforward. It's about data. So I'm sure you've heard the fact that medicine has become personal, right? And I used to duke it out with people. In fact, funny story, 2015, Yahoo had asked me to define personalized medicine. And I was a big advocate of precision because to me, it's about looking at data, having real facts, not just being personal. Being personal to me is why you become a doctor. Every doctor should be personal about their patient because everyone's unique. And I remember saying, can I make it personalized medicine, also known as precision medicine? And they said no. And so then Obama, was doing his State of the Union in 2015, his second term, and he defined precision medicine as the right medicine at the right time for the right person. So I got a call back from the editor saying, we're so sorry, we should have included precision. And then everyone across the country, from Mayo to Duke, pulled down their signs and called it precision medicine. So that's where it started for me. I felt like what we wanted is precise data to make a difference for every woman and every man.
Right. Well, look, you have this book and I'll show it's behind you too. Invincible, right? Defy your genetic destiny to live better longer. And you've been doing this a long time and told a personal story that it was like your dad, like, how do I stay healthy? I want to be around for you all, and you have a twin sister, et cetera. So let's just talk about how you got into it a little bit and then more about, the book, et cetera. We'll get into that.
Yes, I graduated Yale Medical School, obviously very prestigious, well known. And my dad said at graduation, because he was a health nut, he was one of these, I want to stay well and live a long life. I don't want to get sick. And he said, okay, my brilliant daughter, tell me how to stay healthy. And I looked at him blank. We don't learn about health in medical school or healthcare. We learn about disease. It's a disease-centric, doctor-centric model that I realized left us wanting more because as I started seeing people and recognizing how diseases really could destroy your life and is difficult for family and you can't enjoy life, and yet we're living longer because of antibiotics. It came to be in the mid 19th century. And so I realized that we were missing it. We were missing looking at a complete system. I think of it, well, originally everyone thought of as mind body, but as an endocrinologist, you study the whole system and endocrine hormones and neurotransmitters and all these variables from the time we're born in utero, actually, even before we're born, to each decade of life begins to change and has a huge impact on how we age and diseases we get. So I thought, you know what? If I could keep people between 25 and 30, so I wasn't anti-aging. I think it's a gift to age every year, blow out another candle. But it's about how do you stay strong and vital and dance at your great-great-grandchildren's wedding at 120. That really is the goal to me. And don't sit on a porch, don't be sick in a rocking chair, really live life to the fullest. So the goal was to stop biological aging as opposed to chronological aging.
You're saying you can actually move past your genetic markers.
Another epiphany rose out of the fact, also my parents, that they had identical twins, me and my twin sister, Harriet. And she's a smarter twin. She became a dermatologist, so she looks great. If you see us on Insta, she has fewer wrinkles than I do. So she knows more tricks, but she gives me most of them. And I realized that we were not exactly identical. So we had the same genetic makeup. We inherit the same DNA, but it didn't express in the same way. So there were differences between us anatomically speaking. I'm a little taller. She's now a little thinner. I can live on fish, sashimi and sushi are my favorite, and she doesn't touch fish. She's an amazing gardener, and I basically murder plants. And there's a lot of other differences. And I realized we have the exact genetics, but we're not living the same life in the same space, even from the moment we divided in utero, right, as identical twins. If you have fraternal twins like you do, a boy and a girl, obviously, right from the get-go, it's a different makeup. They might be similar, but they're not gonna inherit exactly the same genetic makeup. And I thought we practice medicine as a one size fits all, as if all of us are the same, part of deriving it from population research. And even the data we get that's considered normal is a range of data in people who are not healthy because we're not looking at health, we're waiting for people to get sick. So I felt that if you could look more critically at the data about a person, the precision aspect under the surface at their entire system and connect the dots, we could help people make choices as they move forward in life as to whether they are fit for intermittent fasting or do they need to do something else or is it dangerous for them, which it is for about a third of the people I see. What is the risk that runs in their family? And because that is likely to run in them. So, how do they stop dementia, diabetes, osteoporosis? Even in myself, as an example, at the time, I knew osteoporosis was a very strongly genetic factor on both my mother and father. I had an aunt, a paternal and maternal aunt, who each of them died as a result of osteoporosis, directly and indirectly. And I started on testosterone over 30 years ago to keep my bones as solid as possible. My sister started with less time, about 15 years ago, and she has early osteoporosis, and I don't. So there's ways of intervening both by the choices you make in sleep, in food, in exercise, and stress, the choice where you live that can change your genetic propensity. So think of your DNA as a draft, and basically you can rework it so that it doesn't have to express dementia or diabetes or any of the other diseases of aging.
It's incredible. But you said something kind of earlier in there saying that the data that we have is only for sick people.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means that when you see ranges and your doctor says to you, "You're fine, you're in the normal range," you're being compared to everybody, and all of them have disease brewing under the surface because you don't wake up one day and have diabetes. It's been brewing for decades, not even just years. The same is true of heart disease. The same is true of dementia. So by picking up those earlier signals and actually looking at optimal levels, which are different than these average ranges of population research where take any lab, Quest, LabCorp, they're going to a state. Sometimes I pick on Oklahoma, and they get 1,000 people, and they get this range for what the number should look like. For example, sugar, we're told if you look at a regular printout that you can have a sugar that's fine up until 99. In fact, your fasting sugar should be 70 to 80. If it's in the 80s and 90s, you're what we call hyperglycemic, and that means you're on your way to diabetes. Or if your hemoglobin A1C, even with the popular work being done in Ozempic and tirzepatide and all the other GLP-1s, you'll see the ad for Ozempic is 000 less than 7. You want a score of hemoglobin A1C of less than 7. Well, 6.5 to 7 is diabetes or higher. And 5.7 as a average sugar over the last 100 days to 6.4 is pre-diabetes. Almost everybody is there. And so figuring out what's going on in you and what optimal truly is the way to keep your health for life.
I had that situation where my cortisol level was spiking and I had to do a fasting blood work and it was still off the charts. And both endocrinologists I went to go see, both women said, oh, it's normal range. And I was like, how is that normal when it's off of the chart? I was like, I don't accept it. You know what I mean? But that's a luxury. Like I get to say that sitting in Tribeca with my 2 kids and, having a job where I get to like interview you in the podcast. Like, how are people supposed to keep up? Women, we're exhausted. We are in sandwich generations. We're doing this stuff. It's like, it doesn't seem there are any doctors. I mean, you're one, and you even say in your book, like it's very expensive, right?
And also, when you were pregnant, you might have had an oral glucose tolerance test. Many women are just told, oh, you're fine, when it's actually borderline. Why are you given an oral glucose tolerance test? Because a baby is a stressor for the body. Just like cortisol increases sugar and puts weight around the middle. And that's well known. There are diseases that we know that cortisol is part of, like Cushing's, but all of us have stress hormones, which is cortisol is one of them, that go up and down. And when they go up, it increases your sugar. And it's not good for your body. Think about it. Sugar travels all over to get to your brains and every cell to fuel. In fact, this may get a little convoluted, but hemoglobin A1C are little red blood cells coated with sugar. Think of jelly donuts. They travel everywhere because red blood cells release oxygen everywhere in your body. So think of these little red blood cells that are sugar loaded that go to your brain, that go to your liver, that go to your heart, that go to your kidneys, your eyes. That's what diabetes is. And so by lowering that load, by lowering your cortisol, so doctors are trained, unfortunately, with disease. So if you show up with diabetes, they jump all over it and they're great. But diabetes has been brewing for decades. And if we know optimal, then we could target optimal without being obsessive about it. I believe in moderation, not deprivation. I have a sweet tooth. It's not sugar that's the enemy or any of these other ways of living. It's how do you do, if you think of it, atomic habits for longevity. How do you make baby changes that you can own despite aging parents, being a sandwich generation, taking care of kids, making decisions, making a living, and still focus on what you could do, not only to change your own expression of genes, but your children's. Because I know that from my children, because I was able to detect what was going on. And I could say to them now, listen, you need to take methylated B vitamins because I have a gene that makes it hard to use B vitamins in its regular state. And if you take this methylated version, you're going to absorb it and you'll avoid deep vein thromboses, emboli, early heart attack, hearing loss. That is not something that you can see. We don't have x-ray vision and we don't know enough. But doctors, unfortunately, aren't trained in proactive medicine. Think of what I'm talking about in terms of healthy longevity as being proactive as opposed to reactive.
What's the difference with functional medicine then?
So functional medicine to me is a deep study of the human being in what regular conventional medicine does, because we think about it. They talk about root cause of disease. We talk about etiology, looking at every aspect of the system and how it works together, but not necessarily proactive, not necessarily jumping in and saying, this is what I see brewing. In effect, and Silicon Valley called it a superpower about 10 years ago for me. It was simple for me because when I looked at numbers in a human being, I could connect the dots and see the path you were on. I felt every doctor did that because we all trained in every field. It's really about envisioning what is the path you're on and how do we stop it without resorting to extremes by introducing it into our life in a way that we can own. And that's where the book came from, really. How do I extrapolate, JJ? I actually planned on bringing this to everyone over 30 years ago because I felt that in order to do this work, people had to be able to afford it. And I come from an immigrant family. We couldn't afford much of anything when we were growing up. My parents were amazing, of course. They kept us well fed. Education was huge. My brother, my sister, and I are all doctors. The next generation, there are three of them as well, and finance people and this and that. So obviously, they had the wherewithal to imbue in us a way to learn. And I'm insatiably curious, another gift I got from my father and mother, and ask a lot of questions. But we need to know what's going on, and we need to be able to say, okay, if I maybe go to sleep 15 minutes earlier, I can improve my quality of sleep, not just the quantity of sleep. And I talk about all of this in the book, how you can own it and how you can extrapolate. So 30 years ago, I thought about bricks and clicks. Do you remember that term? Around the time of the internet, genetics was being described by a guy named Craig Venter and another guy. They kind of shared first to market with it. It cost billions to get your genes. Now it costs maybe 1,000 or less. I thought about the fact that if I could prove this model and do in a proof of concept, so there was a return on your investment, you would ultimately be able to own it. And I felt like everyone should own their own health destiny. There are never going to be enough physicians to help people in that way, because at least in this century, there's still too much disease and we have to stop disease, right? The moonshot being, can we stop chronic disease in this century?
What's the intersection with wellness? You know what I'm saying? It's like there's all these things and pills, et cetera. And when you say stop disease, you're talking about lifestyle changes for the most part, or they're medicines you take.
The lowest hanging fruit is how do you change the way you live life, right? Those are the things you have some control over. Can you get not just the 6 to 8 hours of sleep, but quality sleep? Are you actually getting deep sleep, which washes your brain every few minutes? There's a system called lymphatics that gets rid of metabolic waste and stuff that piles up and damages your sleep, which leads to early disease and death earlier. If you don't get quality sleep, you're damaging your ability to think and function, be creative, particularly deep sleep and REM. Those two work together. We hear a lot about getting enough sleep, but monitoring and using wearables to the extent people are comfortable, whether it's an Apple Watch or Whoop, or Aura, Garmin, those all help us figure out what's going on inside ourselves. In fact, the most vital one to me, which I feel everyone should try at least for a couple weeks, and then if they make changes, pick another couple weeks to test it, is the continuous glucose monitor. So I feel like at this day and age, we can do virtual wellness, which as a term, it's so broad. It ranges from spas and massage to just making sure you go for a walk in nature, which does lower your blood pressure. And there's a lot of techniques we could use that don't cost hardly anything. Even a continuous glucose monitor costs $40 or $50, and you can monitor it on an app on your phone.
So I have a friend Mia, who is really into glucose monitors. I didn't know that you could just buy it at the pharmacy.
Yeah, you can get it there. The ones that just came to market in the last year or two, one is called Lingo, and that's made by Abbott, and one is called Stella, and it's made by Dexcom. And I tested both Libra, which is the original prescription version, and I use that because then I could follow people and I could absolutely finely tune what's going on. And the other one is Dexcom, which in the early days was harder because it was Bluetooth and it didn't always work well. So I tested it back about 6 to 8 years ago and saw how they were useful and how we should use them and implement them. Now that they're available over the counter, everyone can get one. And some people either are in denial, they don't want it, they think they might not turn into their mother, but They might. So it's really important to know. If your mom's, for example, had a heart attack or heart disease or diabetes, you want to know what's going on so that you could stop it in its tracks when you're in your 30s or 40s instead of waiting to get sick or have fallout from the diabetes, have a heart attack, blindness, any kidney disease, cognition issues and memory, libido. All of that kind of exaggerates it and magnifies the kind of symptoms we find in the perimenopause and menopause.
You say there's 4 tests, blood tests that everyone should get, like it was kind of in the beginning of the book. Can you describe what those are? And are those things that doctors actually test us for when we get yearly physical exams?
Only in part. So, first of all, it's 5, and 3 of them have to do with how sugar affects us. Like, I'm not talking about eating sugar per se, because as I said, sugar is not the enemy. If it was, I would have a hard time getting through life. It's more about how what you do and what you eat and other factors interact with your own genetic makeup and how you can use epigenetics to change that. And I can give you examples. But basically, the 5 are fasting sugar, which most doctors will do. If your doctor says, come on in any time of day and I'll draw your blood, don't do that. Say, oh no, I want my blood drawn when I'm fasting overnight, because that will give us a point in time to say this is what should be going on. Whereas if you've eaten, your sugar is going to change over a course of several hours. The hemoglobin A1C is not often done, but now I think women are asking for it. Hemoglobin A1C is an average, I alluded to it before, of the last 100 days of how much sugar on average is circulating in your body. You want that number to be less than 5. The third one is fasting insulin, almost never done, yet probably the first predictor of diabetes and disease. And not only is insulin, if it's up 3 hours or more after you eat, and certainly after a fast, then you're on your way to insulin resistance and you're going to get disease, not just diabetes, but dementia and actually even cancer and osteoporosis, because it interferes with bone, it interferes with inflammation and the immune system. So those 3 tell us a lot about the direction you're headed. And one of the reasons they do it in pregnant women, because they want to protect babies in utero even, because babies are affected if mothers have higher sugar and higher insulin. The fourth one is cholesterol risk ratio, which is part of the lipid profile. It's actually the total divided by the good cholesterol. Now, it gets a little trickier than that, but that's a good place to start. And you want that under 2. And then the last one, which is almost never done unless you request it, and even then you might be turned down, is free testosterone. So we women have more testosterone circulating than estrogen at any given time. And yet it's not even approved in this country. It's off label if you get a prescription for testosterone. And remember, I just alluded to the fact that I've been taking it for 30 years because we all know that estrogen affects bone in perimenopausal and menopausal women, but testosterone is even more powerful. And that's why men get osteoporosis 10 years after women. We get heart disease 10 years after men. They start in their 30s. We start in our 40s. Bone loss in women start in our 40s. We can get Colles fractures of the wrist. We can collapse and get a buffalo hump called kyphosis. So we shrink and we can fracture hips. And 1 in 3, if it's not you, it's one of your 2 best friends in the future. And men get it and they catch up, but it starts 10 years later because testosterone is powerful for bone and muscle growth. We need it. Young women, even on birth control pills, should be getting testosterone tested because it suppresses testosterone. We don't give birth control pills with testosterone, just estrogen and progesterone. So they're actually at higher risk for osteoporosis, and they should be getting testosterone cream. And it's extremely safe. There are absolutely no side effects that I've seen, although in medicine, we never say 100%. We say 99% because it's never all or nothing usually. So those are the 5: fasting glucose or sugar, hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulin, fasting cholesterol risk ratio, which is total divided by HDL. You want that less than 2. And the last one's free testosterone, and you want that between 6 and 30. And I'm specifying free because there is a common test, not done in women generally, but a lot done in men, called total testosterone. But most of testosterone is bound up in protein. So you actually have to measure the active portion of it, which is free testosterone.
So would your primary doctor do this for you?
They might. The reason they might not, and I've faced this with many patients who come to me, is if they don't know the area, they're reluctant to get the results because they're responsible. So doctors For example, years ago, I spoke a fair amount for a group called Tiger, and I still remember one man saying he was going to get his genetics tested. Craig Venter had set up an institute in San Diego, and his own doctor wouldn't sign off on the tests because he didn't know enough about it and he didn't want to be responsible. So I did, because obviously it's my area of expertise. But that is the main reason a doctor might say no. Now, it's opening up some, with the taking off the black label off of estrogen, progesterone, based on the poor trial, the Women's Health Initiative. A whole generation of women really suffered in the last 20 years. I think doctors are becoming more knowledgeable and more comfortable, but still the training is not quite there for even menopause. It's abysmal. I think the doctors who know the most about hormones, but basically focus on fertility, are fertility doctors who study reproductive endocrine and endocrinology. And I was lucky because I studied all four fields. I studied reproductive endocrine, which is the way the brain relates to the ovaries or testicles in men, and the adrenal glands, which is cortisol, adult endocrinology, which is thyroid, lipids, osteoporosis, diabetes, of course, a number of other areas, lipids, and also in children, growth and development and puberty, all of that, fertility, all of that.
This precision medicine and what you're doing, you say that there's like 7 markers that you can reverse.
All of the markers are reversible.
But in your book, it's like the 7
patterns of aging. The way I decided to write this, and I don't know if you ever heard of the book Color Me Beautiful? It was a way of saying what colors are best suited for you. And actually, Amazon's doing something like that called Capsule, where you can answer a questionnaire and they'll tell you what's the right clothing you should wear to bring out the best in yourself. Anyway, Color Me Beautiful was like spring, winter, summer, and fall. I thought of the way to present it would be to picture yourself as these patterns. So if dementia runs in your family, there's a whole chapter on the brain and what you can do, because dementia isn't just Alzheimer's. That's such a misunderstanding. There's high blood pressure, which is vascular dementia. So you don't get blood pressure treated under 120/80. You can get a lack of flow of oxygen to your brain and you can look like you have dementia. There's also thyroid. I've seen thyroid irregularities and low thyroid in about 80% of the people I evaluate, because I think it's something that happens with aging. The thyroid and the stimulation to the thyroid from the brain isn't as well put together as when we were younger. And so if you have low thyroid, it affects cognition and memory and is another cause of dementia. Electrolyte management. We all think we should be well hydrated, but guess what? Overhydration is more of a problem, particularly as we age, or even for athletes in marathon runners. Drinking too much water and diluting your electrolytes, sodium and potassium, is even more dangerous. And you die. There have been deaths from overhydration. So there's a lot that you'll find out in each chapter. There's a chapter about how to use the continuous glucose monitoring and why sugar underpins all of these diseases. And yet, despite my diagnosing diabetes and risk of diabetes in everyone, because it's a survival gene, these are genes that helped our ancestors get through bad times, right? Lean times. If you didn't make it through lean times, your genes weren't inherited. So all our genes come from people who lived through cavemen, cave women, Holocaust, the Irish famine. We all have a propensity for diabetes, which underlies almost every disease of aging. In fact, I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Post in November that talks about that and why. I haven't treated one person with insulin, type 2 and other variations of type 2 in my entire career as an endocrinologist, which again is unheard of. So I used to have people laughing at me when I talked about N of 1 medicine and how you don't really need insulin because you can reverse diabetes. So there's a whole chapter on that. There's a chapter on thyroid. There's a chapter on bones and muscle called sarcopenia and osteoporosis. The organ for longevity that actually packages sugar and also keeps us strong is muscle. So in order to maintain muscle, you need testosterone, you need enough protein in your diet, and you need resistance exercise. And those three together will protect us from so much as we age. There are diseases like cancer and AIDS where, as a physician, you might have not heard this term, but it's called cachexia. So you lose muscle, but you're also losing fat. And that's when disease really strikes. So we need to keep our muscle and not put on fat. And once we hit sort of the 30s, and you probably know women who look absolutely magnificent. They come in, there's a prototype. And again, I've recognized prototypes now over the years, and they put on 2, 3, 4 pounds, literally never more than 5. And they don't know why, because they've been doing everything perfectly. They work out, they manage to fit everything in their life, but their testosterone's falling in their 30s, and it's impossible to keep the weight off, particularly around the middle. So those are the basic chapters, and let me see if there's any other. So it's sugar, it's heart disease, it's menopause and andropause, it's thyroid, it's osteoporosis and muscle, and it's brain. Now, those are all 7. Each one of us has to have at least one because male or female biologically, we're gonna go through either menopause or andropause, but the others are open for everybody.
This is just so important because, as we age and our kids are getting older and our careers are like they're at their height and they're stressful, and you go to a doctor like I did to 2 different endocrinologists, and like, your cortisol level is fine. I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not okay.
What did you do about it?
Nothing.
But meditation, actually based on studies out of Harvard and Wisconsin, shows that you turn off the gene. This is a good example of epigenetics. If I had seen you, I would have said, let's try some meditation because it turns off the gene that leads to increased cortisol. And while meditation sounds like it's difficult, and it is, probably with women like us, turning off your head, I fall asleep. My head is always like active, right? My brain. But you can do deep breathing, which can lead you into being more meditative, or yoga, and find ways to reduce your cortisol.
And that's what I did. So I started meditating over a year ago. I do it for 20 minutes every day. It's a non-negotiable. I love my sleep. I sleep very well. I hate getting up with an alarm, but when the kids are in school, like, I have to get up at 6 so I can meditate for 20 minutes before they go. You know what I mean? So I can get everything else done before they're going off to school. But yes, I agree. But then, I went to my gynecologist and I've been treated by a menopause doctor, perimenopause, and she was like offended that I went there. She's like, well, what else do you want me to treat with? I was like, the same things as before I had kids. What are you talking about? But it's hard to, like, doing everything else. It's hard to advocate for yourself with your doctors when your doctors aren't educated on what you're talking about. What doctor do I need to talk to? And which one is going to, like, see me as me instead of just a fact pattern across all these other women, across all these other states who have totally different lifestyles and genetics. I think you're doing it and talking about it is so important. One of the things that I noticed in your book too is you're a fan of GLP-1s.
Oh, big. I've been using it since the day one because as an endocrinologist, they called on me first. So I started in 2005 with the first one called Byetta, and I test everything on myself because one of the things as a clinical investigator, I do. I do. I'll tell you what happened with it, but I'm trained at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and so I went to Yale, then I trained a couple of years of residency, went to NIH, did a fellowship, and stayed on faculty there. That's when I worked in peptides for men, women, and children, and brought it back to Yale. And then I joined the faculty, and I was in 3 departments. Of course, as we all are overachievers, the women you interview for sure. And so I was able to implement my work and start women's health in 1992. What you want to do with the GLP-1s, it's actually, to me, they're equivalent to antibiotics of the 20th century. And the way I wrote the book, there's a chapter on that too at the end. I don't include it in patterns, but I talk about the validity. It's not necessarily something that should be put into the water, and some part of me is not thrilled with how readily available it is because I think it can be dangerous because it's medical. It's gonna interfere with your body. We make GLP-1s in our brain and in our belly, but the ones that you get as prescription are more powerful and last longer and have a great effect on those of us who need it. So when I was taking Byetta at the beginning, which you had to take as a shot before every meal, I would go out to some great restaurants, and lava cake was one of my favorite, and I didn't want it. It was the most amazing thing, my brain and my belly. It was like, "No, I don't feel like it. I'm not interested." And then, of course, if I went out again, I realized it. I held it for that meal. When you take it for the week, you can't really hold it. But when I wanted to eat, I could eat. So they have a miraculous effect on a lot of the organs of the body. They're showing some effect on breast cancer and decreasing the risk, on the brain, because of what they do in the body. So it's beyond just the weight loss. It's beyond fat loss, although that's critical, and obesity is dangerous and it leads to disease, just like a lack of adequate sleep. I think they're like antibiotics. For me, they're the antibiotics of the 21st century. But it has to be used judiciously. So all of these, part of the social media, I think, trends is to hear about something, and it finally got out there. It did take about 20 years because I was in it longer, and I didn't contribute to that because I'm not an influencer, and as you mentioned before, most of the influencers are bros who really didn't know much about women's health, and that was always scary to me. I mean, they knew facts, but they didn't know real management of people, and a lot of influencers are doing the work for themselves, like a Brian Johnson, good ideas, but spending over $2 million a year. I don't know if you know his hashtag don't die, but it doesn't drill down to each and every one of us, woman or man. And so being able to get the right fit is part of why I wrote the book, because you can cherry pick what would be make sense for you. And just a couple of tips for the doctors who may not know, because doctors are encouraged to practice standard of care. If they don't, if a patient gets into trouble, they're responsible. So they generally follow patterns and standards. And if they're not trained in anything, they don't want to go there. But one of the ways to help them is to say, my mother had a heart attack at 65. That was the very first woman I saw at Women's Health. She was near 40. She was just thinking of having children in 1992. And she said, look, my father's still alive because he got angioplasty and stents in his 80s, but my mother died of a massive heart attack, and the doctor told her it was empty nest syndrome and gave her a prescription for Valium. She was having heart disease. And so understanding what's going on in each of us and using the right tools, but in a wise way, as opposed to just taking information and thinking we can figure it out. I don't know what I don't know, because how do you know what you don't know, right? How could I have answers if I don't have all the questions? And so I'm always learning. That's the biggest part of being a physician. So tell the physician or clinician why you're scared, why you're nervous. Bring the book, buy another book, because I did it with references, JJ. It's so every because I knew doctors would question this. And I think something working in my favor is I'm credentialed. I've published, I've been on the faculty at Yale for over 2 decades. So it's hard for people to discuss that kind of thing with me and call me like a quack or anything, because I have real deep knowledge and I've done the research.
I mean, even when you're talking about like methylated like vitamins, et cetera, because I happen to do some research on it and understanding those things. I find that so many doctors like push back on things like that, like GLP-1s and methylated vitamins, and think it's like all woo-woo or wellness, or and somebody's just trying to hook. So I love the fact that yes, you're Yale educated, you are an actual doctor, you've seen this work, you've changed people's lives.
I feel grateful that I can. In fact, one of my sons had a food issue and he couldn't eat broadly. And so I started using supplements, but would keep them in the closet at Yale before I opened it up to telling people they need to eat all the colors of the rainbow, because doctors, they're not prejudiced. They're just uneducated in that regard, health. They're educated deeply in disease. It's why we tackled COVID so well. And after a while, people didn't just die, but they're not educated in how to keep our health, because medicine arose out of people living longer and getting sick. And now chronic disease is ubiquitous. Like as you age, most people, the older generation, that the pre-baby boomer, they live long, but not in good health. There was just a study in Lancet that reported on that if you make these lifestyle choices, you can change the length of years you live in good health. That's really the goal. I don't want to live long and be sick.
No, and I think, and what I love so much about what you're doing, what you're saying, is that you have to advocate for yourself. You have to ask the questions. You give everybody the tools to say, like, here are the things that I want, the blood work that I want taken. And, you might not be the right doctor, then we have to find the right ones.
Exactly, and there were references, so every chapter has the scientific basis of why I did what I did and how I did it. Even somebody who's surrounded by physicians like Brian Johnson, and he supposedly has this great team, and I was on a little video cast with him, and he's obviously working very hard to keep himself healthy. He just reported some illness he had in his stomach, like, autoimmune disease, and he's blaming it on sugar and living a poor quality life for a decade, but he had Hashimoto's thyroiditis when he was younger. So that is an autoimmune disease very common in women and in men of the thyroid. That is why he has a propensity to what he's gotten now, autoimmune disease of the stomach, where he can't really digest food well. And so it's a little misleading to say without that medical basis, he should be saying, listen, I have this propensity to it. But that's where the book should help, because if you figure out what runs in you, what runs in your family, how you're living life, there are pieces you could put together to make a difference for your life, for each of us.
For those of us who have kids, like at what age should they start getting these kinds of tests?
When I first started, JJ, you'll find this interesting. They call me a doctorpreneur, which is unusual in medicine. And my sister's not a risk taker. I am a huge risk taker, but it arises out of being a clinical investigator where I look at people as risk benefit. I look at anything we do as risk benefit. Do you get a more benefit? What is the risk? And how do you make a decision about anything you do, whether it's a supplement, changing the way you eat? It's dangerous for some women to fast for more than 3 hours. They become severely hypoglycemic, which isn't good for the brain or the heart. I have a woman patient who has severe heart disease, and she looks like a model of health. She's done everything right. She's a tennis player, and she could bring everything to the table that she wants. Severe heart disease because their sugar's too low, or women who can't get pregnant because their sugars are too low. And I've helped women conceive because of that. Ideally, if you're starting this as an adult, it'd be great to establish your baseline in your 20s. Truth be told, in what I've been doing, and with all transparency, is I wanted to focus in my area of work. But I got to know each person so deeply that they started bringing their family and their children. So we have people from age 10 to 90s. The original startup for me was 30s to 60s, thinking you can make a change there. But you can see what's going on. So I have a lot of people asking me about their children and bringing their children in. And as I said, sometimes when you see a couple, let's say, do you know about the gene ApoE4?
No.
So ApoE4 puts you at high risk for cholesterol issues, which obviously is heart and brain, arteriosclerosis or blockages, right? And also for Alzheimer's. And so if one of them has a homozygote, meaning they had inherited from their mother and father this ApoE4, as opposed to 2 or 3, and the other parent has one ApoE4. So I have a couple like that where one is homozygote, already has early Alzheimer's, but he's in phenomenal shape. He has percent body fat of like 7%. She has severe heart disease, and her ApoE4 situation is what we call heterozygote, not homozygote. She has one gene that's ApoE3, which doesn't confer increased risk, and one that's ApoE4, which does. So I knew immediately that all their adult children between 20 and 30 are going to either be like the father or like the mother, the way they would inherit it. So you can start from the get-go, even children in grade school or younger. So my particular genetic status of the MTHFR, with that gene, it caused me to lose some hearing in one ear years ago, because when you get a virus and you don't have enough vitamin B, you can get what we call sudden sensory neurohearing loss. So I knew my sons had to inherit at least one gene. It turned out that their father was heterozygote, meaning he had one good gene and one variant gene. So one son is like me and one son is like his father. And so from the beginning, without even doing testing further, I knew they needed methylated Bs. And their children will need methylated Bs, particularly in the one that has. So there's extrapolation that I'm able to do because I write about that in the book, how you can think about it. So that's why I ended up, in a way, while I do precision medicine, I also see the whole human being, and many of them don't go to another doctor, even when I beg them, because we have a practice in Silicon Valley and in Miami Beach. And I'm like, if something happens urgently and you might need a doctor locally, but most of the time to date, if you get pneumonia or COVID, we helped everyone. So I'm not worried anymore, but I was at the beginning. And now I have a great clinical team. So we take care of the whole human being.
Does this apply to allergies as well, which are so common in young kids, right?
So here's one of the pieces of the story for allergies. Years ago, I learned that there's a bug called H. pylori, which is part of our natural microbiome in our stomach and in our gut. And it's supposed to be there. But when it overgrows, they associated it with ulcers. So after a while, they wanted to wipe it out. So as a result of wiping it out, because later in life, when you have H. pylori, you have a high likelihood in your 80s and 90s of getting stomach cancer. So this is a little hard to follow, so I'm going to go as slowly as I can. not because you're not smart, but because it is complicated. So they wiped out H. pylori. I actually had it myself, and I had to take 2 or 3 courses of antibiotics about 15 years ago because I actually had some cells in my stomach that didn't look normal, and I fixed it. And the reason they wiped it out is they didn't want stomach cancer and they didn't want people to get ulcers. Well, it turns out by wiping it out, young children now don't get it because the way they got it is through fecal oral contaminants. So through stool. And so you catch it when you're a little kid and you got it. And because it's wiped out, there's been a rampant increase in asthma, allergies, and early esophageal cancer as opposed to stomach cancer. Our bodies have to be in balance in some ways, and understanding the pieces that make that up mean to me that H. pylori should be in your system to some extent, but not overgrown. And there, if it overgrows or there's nothing, then you're going to suffer the consequences. So that balance is important. And sometimes we're excessive in our approach. Like, I've had people who believe strongly in an all plant diet, which is very hard to get all the nutrients you need and all the protein you need. I've examined people who have migraines, difficulty sleeping, their sugars are way too low, so they have trouble conceiving, trouble in IVF, they can't make good eggs. And by correcting their diet, not necessarily turning them into, steak eaters every single night, but some balance so they take some protein in that's good for their body, they are much healthier. So again, each of us needs a certain, just like I mentioned, intermittent fasting. Like I can fast all day. In fact, right now I sipped on a shake I make every day and I didn't finish it yet. And it's already afternoon. I'm not hungry. I know my sugar stays fairly stable because I wear a CGM because I'm a data geek, right? But there are women who can't do that. One of my closest friends in high school worked with me a little bit, used to have pasta at lunch, and then she'd sit in front of me and kind of fall asleep almost. And now she's in amazing shape because we changed her diet, but she can't go more than 3 hours without having some kind of food. And so for those women, as I write in the book, make a trail mix you like. Put in some dark chocolate, put in yogurt or dried raspberries, dried cranberries, and raisins, and put in nuts like omega-3s, like walnuts and pistachio and cashew. And you can get yourself by because it's actually pretty bad to have a very low sugar too. It's a precursor to diabetes and disease, but it also makes you feel pretty crappy.
Thank you so much for everything here. You know what I mean? It's like giving women the power back to have power themselves is, the reason why we exist and this podcast exists. And it just gives so many great advice and tips. We have to put ourselves first. We have to, do this in it's like the oxygen mask. So I so appreciate this. There's one question we ask everybody on this podcast, and that is, what is the worst advice you've ever received?
The worst advice I ever received is to don't take risk. Why rock the boat? What are you doing? Laughing at me because of the N of one, meaning each one of us needs attention. And that was largely at Yale. I guess I was lucky enough because we were of a generation where we women question. That's what your podcast is all about. We recognize the inequities. I was one of 9 in a class of 100 to graduate, one of 9 women. I was different from the get-go, but I never thought about it. So I just stuck to my convictions, and I guess my father helped, and the fact that it worked, and I set up a way to look at women and men prospectively. I actually have a protocol scientifically grounded because I knew in academia I could say I needed to prove the model, and that's what I have. And that's part of why I'm so adamant about getting out there now and the book, because there's so much misinformation. So I think listen to your soul, listen to your heart. If you feel uncomfortable and you know the path you're on, figure out a way to do it. And I think we women are pretty good at that because we generally have to work around everybody else to put our needs in place. And your example of the oxygen mask is something I use all the time, when you hear it on a plane, because you want to. We are caretakers, natural caretakers. We want to take care of everybody in our life, but that means we need to take care of ourselves.
No, agree. Thank you so much. If people want to find you, how do they do that?
At Florence Comite or Dr. Florence Comite on Insta, also Florence Comite on LinkedIn. The website is comitemd.com to learn about the process and how to think.
And the book is called Invincible. Defy your genetic destiny to live better longer. Here it is,
Oh, thank you
everyone.
so much. That was a work of, I don't know how I got that done because I couldn't stop my regular day job.
I know.
What is your book going to be called?
Right now it's called the Ask Filter, but it could change, but we'll see. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on this episode of Taking Care of Lady Business. Until next time, I'm Jennifer Justice. Thanks to MedJet for supporting the Taking Care of Lady Business podcast. When you travel for work or internationally, the real question isn't if something could happen, it's whether you've planned for it. That's why I'm a member of MedJet and have been for years. If your security is threatened or you're hospitalized while traveling, MedJet can get you home and to the hospital you choose, not just the closest one. It's not travel insurance. It's about not leaving critical decisions to chance. If you travel regularly, it's worth having in place. You can learn more at medjet.com. Thanks for tuning in to Taking Care of Lady Business. If this was useful, subscribe and share with a friend. Make sure to check out the show notes for more on my guest and me, Jennifer Justice. Taking Care of Lady Business is a production of Lady Business LLC. See you next time.